Welcome to George Fox Digital. I'm Dr. Jessica Hughes, and I'm joined today by Dr. Brooks Lamp, and we're going to be talking through how to do a close reading. Now, this is important for the LIBA 100 class, but it's also just an important skill to learn for your college education, because the more you learn to read closely, the better you will do in all of your classes. So, Brooks, would you tell us a little bit about close reading and what we're trying to accomplish here?
Yeah, thank you. We're the best way to approach this and to think about this is that you're really going to be learning how to write very well in a very specific way. And we're calling this the close reading way, or like it's the close reading essay that we're doing over and over again in this course. It is a really good introduction to college level writing because close reading asks you to be very meticulous about identifying and connecting and synthesizing ideas. But it doesn't require you to do anything that what we call, we would say is like disciplinary in nature. It doesn't require you to have specialized knowledge or skill sets that belong to things like your major program. Any student can do this as long as he or she has a text in front of them and a keyboard to type or, a notepad to write down. All you need is something in front of you and your own brain. And so close reading is a perfect way to practice critical thinking, practice close observation, and to practice thinking about how to put together an argument to make an interpretation about what you're seeing. So that's the goal, and the best way to think about it or to introduce it is just to do it. So that's what we're going to do today. We're just going to do a close reading example for you. We're going to sort of do it verbally out loud. And you'll see in your Foxtail LIBA site, there is a document called the Close Reading and Essay Guide. And this is going to be an important document for you in the course because it has for you all of the best questions that we think are going to get you going in your close reading. So there's a bunch of prompt questions in here. When you're looking at a text and you're thinking about what you're going to write about it, you can refer to those questions. And it also has the close reading activity that we are about to do. And so what we're going to simulate for you is the two-part process of close reading. And the way that this activity breaks it up is it asks you to collect evidence first. Part one is collect evidence, and the second part is form an interpretation. And I want to just point out before we start this example that it's actually quite intentional and important that you treat them as two separate parts. It's important that you actually stay with the text and think about what you're seeing for a while first before you form an interpretation. And that's sometimes a little counterintuitive because when most of us are pretty sophisticated, experienced readers and viewers of art and readers of text. When we see something, we immediately form a impression about it. And the close reading process actually helps us kind of work backwards through how we are arriving at that impression and that interpretation. And if we just jump to an interpretation, that can work sometimes, but for the sake of experiencing this and like practicing it and sort of seeing how it's working, it's important to first just observe things. And so part one, which is what we'll probably spend the most time on here, is just an example of looking at a painting or a paragraph from a story and thinking about what's going on in that paragraph. So that's how the activity is set up. What else, Jessica? Anything else I need to point out or mention?
I think that's really good. I was just going to say to demonstrate how much you don't need specialist knowledge, we've actually chosen to start with a painting. And neither you nor I have been like art history majors. We're not like artists per se. I mean, we both studied we're like literary scholars and writers. So
right.
we're purposely starting with something that is outside of our field because I think that's actually helpful to keep in mind as students that, we do approach these things with kind of a clean slate sometimes, and that actually can help us because we don't know what we're supposed to see yet. And so we want to turn that into kind of an advantage as readers. And so as you come into this class and you're thinking, I'm not an English major, I didn't like reading novels in high school, I don't like looking at paintings. I want to encourage you that sense of like unfamiliarity with these mediums can actually be to your advantage as a reader and to our advantage because we might see things with fresh eyes. So
absolutely,
we're just going to dive in.
And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to open this painting. What is this painting, Jessica?
So this is Exodus 1952 to 66 by Marc Chagall. And that's all I'm going to tell you. I could tell you more, but I'm not going to. And what we see then is this painting that comes in front of us. And there's some questions or some things we should do to start orienting ourselves. One of the phrases I really like that I tell students often is notice what you notice.
Right.
Just pay attention to what you notice, what jumps out at you.
Excellent. Yeah, that's exactly where I would say we should all start, no matter what we're looking at. And in painting especially, is just visually striking and what details stand out to you as you look at this painting. I mean, the first thing I notice is, actually, even though the most prominent feature of the painting is the crucified Christ figure in the top center, it only took me a second or two to notice in the bottom right, apparently Moses holding the tablets of the New Testament, or the Old Testament, I should say, the Ten Commandments from the Exodus story. So that's very interesting because you don't usually see. So I'm just observing what I'm observing. You don't usually see Moses and the crucifix in the same space because those were like widely separate in time. So that's an interesting fact. I don't know yet what to make of that. I'm just noticing that.
I think the other thing that strikes me when I first look at this, when I think of, paintings of the crucifixion, oftentimes they're very, bodily and all that. But what strikes me is how much he uses blacks and grays, right? There's something almost really ominous about this painting that strikes me as different from, the tradition of painting crucifixes where there's like a kind of a holy light around it. There's something very threatening in this painting of the crucifix. I'm looking at like there's like the dark kind of gray circle that looks like the moon almost behind Jesus. That is it a stone rolling to crush the people in the foreground?
Interesting.
Like there's something that feels threatening about that, which I think is also for me heightened by the fire coming out of the shtetl, the houses in the lower left hand corner of the painting. Like there's something that just feels kind of
that looks
happy.
Like. I mean, I don't know. I know some basic things about the shtetl and the Russian Jewish communities in that time and place that those houses look like, and you wouldn't necessarily need to know that historical reference to sort of see there's something ominous and traumatic going on in a historical moment.
Yeah.
But the architecture of the house is probably everybody could tell. You don't need too much historical knowledge to know that this is like this is a post-biblical like town, right? Like this looks like something that would have happened after the events of the New Testament in Christ. So again, a lot of different things that seem to be conjoined in the same space, across time.
Right.
What do you make of the fact that very specific elements and characters are colored in monotone colors, like an all purple woman and all blue woman
and an all white woman,
and then like everybody else is gray or like black and gray toned.
Yeah, I mean, I'd want to think about that, right? It's interesting. The all blue woman is holding a baby that also is like different toned than the other figures. And why is it just the women?
Well, but then I'm
so
kind of counting Moses, like.
Or
if you want to say Moses,
Yeah, with the
Christ, of course,
right.
is got a color to him. But you're
right.
right. There is it's outnumbered by women, which is kind of interesting.
It's also interesting to look at their dresses compared to the other dress. If you really zoom in on the image, a lot of the people are dressed very much like Eastern European immigrants around the turn of the century, right? We see like heavy cloaks, hats, kind of scarves over the hair. Definitely not biblical, and very much of those sorts of like the pictures you see of like immigration, like to Ellis Island sort of thing. But then the women in the blue and the purple, they're not wearing. Are they wearing shoes? It looks like they're almost barefoot.
Yeah, I think they're barefoot.
Almost, it almost feels like they're not the same era.
Right.
Like their dress is just a bit different. And then the white woman, as I zoom in on her, she looks like a bride to me. Like, I don't know if that's right culturally or contextually, but it's.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to second guess that. That
there.
looks. I thought of bride when I saw that too.
But then that's not the only weird, like so that's all kind of what's going on in like the crowds around Jesus. But there's also some strange stuff going on in the upper right and left-hand corners.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too.
So
what are you making of, I was thinking, what in all earth is the chicken? And the more I looked at the painting, I started thinking more in terms of like biblical symbols. So maybe like the Peter cock crowing after Peter. I don't know. Maybe.
And then is that it looks kind of like maybe like a lamb or a ram. behind
Yeah.
that. And, so that, of course, echoes Abraham and Isaac and the ram that gets
Okay.
entangled in the bushes.
Sure.
But also just like these are also farm images, right? Like images of like a peasant sort of town.
Yep.
And
Yep.
then the other side, it looks like a dragon.
Okay, like the snake in the top left.
Yeah, but then
Yeah.
are those wings? Like you see those kind of triangle sail type
Yeah, are
things?
those like flags or something? I don't know.
Yeah. And then there's the woman falling upside down.
Yeah, and that looked almost like she was in a womb or something. It's
Yeah.
like birth imagery or something. But it's very indistinct, and you can't. There's not certainly. It's a little bit indefinite. Like we can't really say for sure what these things are. This is one of the things I'm sort of noticing is our process of observing is leading to several examples of like we aren't sure what we're seeing and what the exact imagery
Yeah.
is here. So that's kind of interesting.
And I think that's actually a good place to be when we start close readings, right? Because what we're doing right now is we're gathering evidence. It's like detectives, right? Solving a murder or something. We're just putting together evidence. There is a rooster in the upper right-hand corner. We don't know what that's about yet, but there's
Exactly.
a rooster.
Yeah.
There's something that looks kind of like a ram. We might have a bride. We
Right.
have a guy holding tablets that kind of looks like Moses. We're starting to put together these pieces,
Right.
but you can't put together the whole puzzle till you have the pieces and you can start to identify and articulate what those things are. So I think for students, this can be a really threatening moment. It's like, I have all these pieces and I have no idea what to make of them yet.
Right.
That's actually okay.
Yeah, and like we said, part one, just observe and gather evidence. We call it evidence because you're going to turn all these observations, these details into your argument. You're going to turn them into evidence, but we don't know what it means yet. So you're just collecting. So we're still collecting. I don't think we have quite enough yet, actually, to make a argument. So I'm going to shift. So we've been thinking about the imageries of the individual pieces, the details, which is great. We could actually continue with that. There's a lot of interesting, very busy painting.
Right.
But I'm going to step out, and the guide questions are written more for language texts than visual painted texts.
Right.
But the idea of the questions is to help you think in terms of different angles or sort of perspectives or ways of seeing. And so we've been thinking about individual elements. Maybe we can think about overall tone or mood or theme or something like that.
Yeah.
For instance, do you get, like you mentioned, your first comment was that it was the color was creating an atmosphere that was kind of negative. And like, do you get the sense that like Christ, the crucified Christ, is more of a positive or negative like feeling in this painting, or something else? I don't know.
It feels really negative to me. Like there's this thing coming up. All the people are turning away from him, like they're running in fear of this thing that's coming.
Yeah.
That's what it feels like to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does seem like that. There's a couple people like looking toward him, but most are turned away. So that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
And if you think about I'm looking at the whole upper third of the painting, and if it's all coming towards them, then it's almost like a whole like tapestry of different like confusing images that are all kind of like overwhelming this group of people. Do you think that's kind of what's going on in terms of the composition? Just like all these things are coming towards these people?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, right? That there's if you kind of divide the picture into thirds, you notice that the top third is the crucified Jesus image, the lamb or ram, the rooster, and this woman being born with the dragon. And it seems like all of that's coming to crush this multitude in the foreground or dominates, right? And even if you look at, there's the lines, the fire line, there's almost like a line going up from the bottom left corner through the fire pointing to Jesus. Another one kind of coming up from the right-hand side as well. So the visual lines of this are also kind of draw your eye there as if there's this kind of these oppositional forces going on in the painting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's and there's little hints in the bottom half of the painting that what is happening to this town is not good. It's destruction. You got the fire. That's probably the biggest hint. But then you've got the woman in the red dress in the bottom right, whose baby appears to have died or is sick. And so it seems like it is maybe a mix of positive and negative imagery, but a lot of negative imagery in that crowd of people. I'm just looking at the hands. Chagall painted all these people's little tiny hands in exactly the same way. I don't know but you can sort of see them like almost creating little, like a forest of little hands or something.
Right.
I don't know. I'm just making observations. I don't know where this is going, honestly, but I'm just observing. Anything else?
Yeah, the observation on the hands is really interesting. There are all of these hands and all kind of like across their breast, like guarding themselves somehow.
Yeah, they kind of something
Yeah.
like defensive, maybe like prayerful or worshipful or
Yeah.
reverent or sacred or something like that. I don't know.
Right.
Let's maybe now we have enough to maybe move on to the second part,
Mhm.
which is form and interpretation. And so as you'll see, the prompt says that now we're going to sort through all of our observations and identify connections and patterns. And what we're trying to ultimately come up with and we're going to produce is a thesis statement, which is a tiny argument in one sentence that tries to relate the details in the painting to the larger question that this text is asking or the conversation or the theme that this painting is evoking.
And this is where we have to start connecting some of the images to how they read in our culture, right? Like
Right.
if we're being honest about what we're seeing, the top third of the painting, these are all images associated with the Christian, like specifically the Christian narrative, right? Jesus, cross, all of that. Peter denying Jesus, the dragon being slain or falling, but also it feels like it's actually coming for the people, right? In this case, like there's something. But all of these are very much associated with the Christian narrative. And so there's this sense of this narrative or these symbols of the Christian tradition not being particularly good for the people in the foreground.
Right. Yeah.
Which is interesting because we've got, like you said, that Moses figure down there holding the 10 Commandments.
Right. If we identify the townspeople here as Jewish and their culture and their identity as Jewish, we can see that there's a juxtaposition, a contrast, an opposition being set up between Christianity and Judaism or something like that.
Well, certainly a sense of threat that Christianity is bringing to, and it should go. I mean, to me, what this painting starts to draw my attention to is that the problem wasn't the problem for the Jewish community isn't Russia. The problem for the Jewish community is a story that dispossesses them from their God and from their tradition and says, you guys don't really matter so much anymore. What matters now is Jesus and the church. And everything God might have said to you in the Hebrew Bible or throughout the centuries, that's all been replaced. And the sort of the violence that story actually does to the identity, and then the construction of the Christian self out of this story is quite often, Christian as opposed to Jew, right? That's the way the construction has worked. And so I think that what we see Chagall kind of zoning in on here possibly is the way that narrative has actually overridden an entire people group.
Well, I think we've gone pretty far, and if we were doing this exercise in a formal way, we would now try to form some kind of thesis statement. I don't know if you have a preliminary one that you want to throw out there. So maybe something like Chagall creates an opposition between Christianity and Judaism by what details? And we would name a couple of the most important details in the painting.
Right.
Like that.
And then I might want to push back and say, is he creating an opposition or is he
or he's
like
representing
drawing our
it.
attention to an opposition,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Helping us
absolutely.
to decenter us as readers or in this case viewers. So this is the process then that happens with writing, right? We come up with one thesis and then we're like, I'm going to change that verb.
Absolutely. Yeah. So he draws our attention to the conflict between Judaism and Christianity by
and one kind of easy way to get going on your thesis then is sometimes to list, 3 or 4 things that 3 or 4 of the ways that he draws attention to that to that conflict or to the threat that Christianity has represented through, color, familiar iconography, and
the way he oriented the painting between top and bottom. We mentioned some of those things.
Yeah. And so you can even just kind of jump into a few of those.
Right.
And then because writing is always a process, we go back and after drafting a paper or some
explanations
explanations or defense, then we'd go back and we'd revise it again because that's what we do. So should we try this on a piece of writing now?
Yeah, let's do it.
Kind of quickly.
In this book that we're about to read in this class. My name is Asher Lev. So this is actually the first page of the novel. And we are going to focus in on the 2nd through 4th paragraphs. I am an observant Jew. Yes, of course. Observant Jews do not paint crucifixions. As a matter of fact, observant Jews do not paint at all, in the way that I am painting. So strong words are being written and spoken about me. Myths are being generated. I am a traitor, an apostate, a self-hater, an inflictor of shame upon my family, my friends, my people. Also, I am a mocker of ideas sacred to Christians, a blasphemous manipulator of modes and forms revered by Gentiles for 2,000 years. Well, I am none of those things, and yet, in all honesty, I confess that my accusers are not altogether wrong. I am indeed, in some ways, all of those things. The fact is that gossip, rumors, myth-making, and news stories are not appropriate vehicles for the communication of nuances of truth, those subtle tonalities that are often the truly crucial elements in a causal chain. So it is time for the defense, for a long session in demythology. But I will not apologize. It is absurd to apologize for a mystery.
So what strikes you, Brooks, as you're reading that?
Yeah, well, we can now kind of lean a little bit more on a reading guide. And the first category is to consider the language. Look for patterns in the things you've noticed about the text. Repetitions, contradictions, similarities, metaphors, similes, symbols, words that have interesting connotations. Some of the contradictions that stand out to me in the first few sentences there are he's saying something about he is a contradiction, right? Like he's a Jew, but he's also a painter, and apparently those things are not allowed to go together, or not typically allowed to go together. So that's a contradiction that he's creating. What else? And there's probably some repetitions in here.
Well, I mean, he repeats the word Jew 3 times in the first 2 lines.
Okay.
Like you can tell, like this is something that keeps just coming up over and over and over again.
I mean, there's also a kind of if you know literary sort of terms and figures, you can also evoke those. I would call what's going on in that second tiny paragraph a kind of paradox. I am indeed in some way all of these things. Like I'm none of these things and I'm all these things. Well, that's what we call like a oxymoron or a paradox. Like you can't be both the thing and not the thing at the same time. But he's kind of saying he is that somehow.
Yeah.
So we'll have to think about maybe a little bit later. We'll have to think about what he's trying to say with that.
I think the other thing that strikes me is the perspectives, right? He starts out, I am an observant Jew. But then it feels like you're getting all these other people's voices kind of what they're saying about him, right? The myths are being generated before we get that list. So the sense of kind of all these titles or all these words being thrown at him.
Exactly.
As he's trying to actually figure out or
articulate
you figure
who
out
he
later,
is
amid this.
Right. So this is like after you've read several sentences, you start to realize, oh, this is what everybody says about him. But he's going to sort of confirm or deny that this is actually how he sees himself, right? And so that's kind of, he's doing an interesting thing. And he gives a name to this, what he's doing at the very end. He calls it a session in demythology. And maybe that's a good word. One of the most helpful steps in the close reading process is to look up words that you are not very familiar with and to see if there's additional meanings or possible meanings to the word that you aren't aware of. So I'm actually going to look up demythology real quick. Here's the definition of demythologize: to reinterpret a subject or text so that it is free of mythical or heroic elements. So it's an interesting word, actually, that might be fruitful to think about if you were interpreting this.
But the other thing then, it comes right before, it calls for a long session in demythology. But I will not apologize. It is absurd to apologize for a mystery, right? It's like he's wanting to push against mythology.
So are you saying that mystery is
mystery
different than a mythology?
Well, I mean, when I think about a mystery, I oftentimes think about something that occupies a similar sort of intellectual realm, right? The realm of the non-empirical, things that are paradoxical, things that don't just make sense because I can observe them 100 times in a lab, but something that maybe goes a little bit beyond human comprehension. So there's this kind of interesting, like, it's like he's trying to find a nuance between mythology and mystery.
Right, because you can't be you can't be on a mission to demythologize, but then also at the same time uphold mystery, right? So again, he's ending his paragraph on a paradox, right? So he's doing this. He's done this a couple of times now. It's like A and not A at the same time. It's like, okay, that's kind of interesting. You're making yourself. Is he making himself deliberately difficult on purpose? Like, why is he doing this?
Yeah. So it kind of already getting us into maybe a character a bit, like that. We're starting to get a glimpse of his psychology, of the things that maybe he's wrestling with in terms of his, this desire to correct the narrative about himself.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can go to, for instance, another set of questions on the guide. Consider the characters. What does this passage reveal about the characters involved in terms of backstory and personality? And so, I mean, this is only the first page of the novel, so we have yet to find out much about this character. But this is a very interesting introduction to a character. Like, what does this passage kind of make you feel about this character? What kind of a person is he or she going to be? And I mean, I would throw out very, very sophisticated, like very subtle thinking going on here.
Yeah.
Kind of nuanced. He even uses the word nuance. What else do you feel about this character?
They seem like someone who's trying to chart their own way. So there's not a clear path for them, right? Like, this is, in some ways, it reminds me very much of like my own sort of, experience in my late teens and early 20s, right? That's sort of like trying to figure out who I am against what everyone else has said about me and all the different sort of labels that I'd picked up. But what is it like? Trying to set the record straight, like trying to figure out who he is. Although you get the sense he's already at the end of that, and this might be the story of that journey.
Right.
But just that sense of that there isn't a clear and easy way to explain who he is. That it's going to take some careful thought.
Yeah. I mean, he says he's a Jew, so we know that about him. He says he's a painter. But one who's now at the end of his life, or towards the end of his life, looking back over his career, he's thinking about what it all means or how he understands it all, and he's comparing that to how he's perceived.
Yeah.
So this is perhaps an older character, maybe?
Possibly. Or someone who's certainly looking back on his life. I mean, he could be 40 looking back on his teens, or 80 looking back on a much larger swath. It's hard to tell at this stage.
And also somebody who's old enough, or I should say mature enough, to have these kinds of thoughts.
Right.
So this is not a naive character. It's not a super young character. So we can tell these things just by the way he's writing.
And I think, too, someone who's mature enough to have made peace with themselves. That I will not apologize.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm done with trying to please everyone. Like, there's a sense of self security.
So I would go off that and say, I would even say there's a sense of resignation. Like he's wrestled with something for a long time and now he's done. So you can see what we're trying to do is we're trying to draw out some of the character traits of this character just from the tone of the passage. And we'd have to be able to point to different words and phrases and statements to be able to back up why we think those things about the character.
Right.
Okay, so then we could continue with this process, but I think once again, let's just preliminarily demonstrate what we're doing in the second step, which is to form an interpretation. So let's come up with a thesis statement of some kind. Let's relate these details to the larger question in the book. Now, if we had had the benefit of reading at least part of this book, we might have also a stronger interpretation in terms of how it's leading to the book that we're about to read.
Right.
But we can still do a preliminary job on that without knowing the book.
So we could start out like in this passage, Potok, and it's really helpful sometimes to use these sorts of helper phrases.
Exactly.
To get yourself started when you're writing. So in this passage, Potok. Now you pointed out juxtaposition to start with. So maybe in this passage, Potok uses juxtaposition to introduce us to a character who is someone who is a sophisticated and thoughtful narrator, considering the mystery of well, we know he's a painter, so maybe like one's artistic and religious identities, right? Because we know those two things are already playing really majorly in his. Yeah.
I mean, we could go kind of we could probably go further with it and say, why would the author start with a character who talks like this and says these things about himself? Probably because this character seems to like be against or on a mission, very purposeful, right? And so we want to be, we want to find out what this mission is, like what he feels so driven to communicate here, because it's a very unusual, like countercultural thing that he's trying to communicate. And so maybe something like in this passage, Potok employs juxtaposition and paradox to engage our curiosity about the character.
Yeah.
That's going to the narrator of his novel, something like that.
And so then as we arrange the evidence, we'd want to talk about how all of this is designed to engage our curiosity about the character.
Right, because there's a lot of questions here, but not a lot of explanations
Exactly.
yet. So that's true to the quality of the passage.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And there's a lot of, now let me also mention that there's a multiple ways, or like there's not just one answer here. There's like a lot of different things we could have said about this.
Yes.
We just jumped from a quick rundown of some observations to a preliminary thesis, but you could come up with a lot of different thesis statements here about this character, about the subject matter to which he's alluding, any number of things. So the wide range of possibilities and what thesis statement or argument or interpretation you would come up with.
So as you go and do your close readings, keep in mind these two big steps. The first one is collect your evidence. Notice what you notice. Just make a list of all those things, circle things, highlight things, jot down all of the pieces, and don't worry if you don't understand the full picture yet. Just gather the evidence. And then once you have a lot of evidence, start to see how patterns or themes or kind of an overarching sort of weight emerges for that evidence. And then you can start to form an interpretation and come up with a thesis. If you can learn to do this really well, college will be way easier for you, especially any of your classes in the humanities. So just keep that in mind. Collect the evidence, then form an interpretation. Have a lot of fun reading. Keep this in mind as you're reading. Read with pencil in hand so you can make notes and you don't have to find stuff later. And good luck. Thanks so much for your time today, Brooks.
You too. Thank you.